And before I sit down, I want to tell you that whatever she writes, they discover 10 years later. She's the pioneer. I mean that seriously. I know that for a fact.
Well, thank you so much. I would like, first of all, to say that whatever small way I have achieved, it really is nothing compared to, particularly in terms of being pioneer, is nothing compared to Yvonne.
Oh, cut it out.
That is true. No, but that is true. I think she is too modest. You know, she is the first person. You know, when people didn't even know who Muhammad Qutb is, she already had written that. But, and as far as, again, neighborliness, I am very fortunate to have her.
This is a mutual admiration society.
Well, it is. It doesn't happen very often, but when it happens, I think that it's very rewarding. And I thank her again for chairing this session. I will try to just say enough to whet your appetite that you will then go and get the book. Because I think that you might actually enjoy reading it. First of all, parts of it reads like a sort of intrigue things when you look into the various factional things in Iran and so on. You know, you suddenly realize that what is at stake is not just some moderate versus some radical and so on. It's far more complex, and in some ways, you know, for Iran's destiny, much more sinister in many ways than just the moderate radical thing. But I think that you might also enjoy it because I think some of the themes that are addressed in the book, some of them are obviously quintessentially Iranian, and that you would not see this in case of other Muslim countries, with the possible exception, I would say, a possible exception of Egypt at some point, and not necessarily now. But the other things, the other cleavages, I think, that I discuss, like, for example, religious secular cleavage, or, for instance, left-right cleavage, and Islamist versus nationalists or other cleavages. I think that it also applies to the case of many of the other Muslim countries. Part of the reason, in fact, we saw some of these things emerge after the so-called Arab Spring. I mean, these divisions became very, very obvious. Like in the case of Egypt, you had the secular opposition, you had the Islamists, and then, of course, each also have their variations. So in many ways also, I think that, again, this is not a particular credit on Iran, but many of these things happened in Iran earlier, in part because of the process started there fairly earlier. And also that a lot of the developments in Iran was much more, initially anyway, was grassroots-based, like the constitutional revolution and so on, rather than a kind of a top-down effort, although that happened as well. So I'm going to look into some of the things. Before starting saying what have been all these, divisions that exist in Iran, there are a couple of things that we have to keep in mind, which I think that makes Iran fairly, I think that a special case in the context of the Middle East. To begin with, Iran is a very old country. Now, admittedly, Iran's history has not been continuous, as many Iranians like to know. It wasn't just that you had the continuous line from the, Medes and going through the Persians and ending up in the Islamic Republic. Obviously, there had been major interruptions. You had Alexander and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, when you really look into the Middle Eastern panorama or Middle Eastern context, there is almost no country in the Middle East whose ancient history still is incredibly relevant and is very much used in the politics of the country. And you will see it discussed in this book. I mean, the question that I talk, for example, what should be more important in Iran's case? Is it Iran as the country and culture and so on, which predates Islam, or Islam? This is not like, Egyptians going to ancient pharaoh. The pharaoh does not strike a chord with ordinary Egyptian, although they are proud that they achieved all this. But in the case of Iran, this thing is very important. And so this is one thing that we have to keep in mind. The other difference between Iran and some of the other Middle Eastern countries, including Turkey and so on, is that as far as their spiritual kind of foundations of their society, Islam is it. They may have minorities and so on. But in the case of Iran, actually, Iranians had a very sophisticated and developed religion, which frankly, in many ways, was the foundation of all even Abrahamic religions. I mean, the concepts of heaven, hell, and Messiah and so on. You have all of this in Zoroastrianism. Now, I'm not saying that this is good or bad, but so that Iranians have a point of reference that they can always use and offers them an alternative, if they want to find another spiritual thing. Not that they want many, most of them still are reasonably happy, but they want that. So I think in that case, we have to really, that Iran, the burden of Iran's history is very strong, both in cultural terms and in other terms. In the case of so I think that this is one thing we have to say. What are very much relevant even today? And I can, if you, I mean, sorry, I don't mean to sound too mercenary and encouraging you to buy the book, but if you want to, but if you
for $100 a copy.
No. But if you really are interested in more detail, all this explains. I would like to say that one of the themes that you see in Iran's history, which of course all countries have, but in the case of Iran, this keeps coming and so on, is a theme of rupture. In other words, Iran's regular historical development had been ruptured at certain points, and that has had an impact. And then, they have taken from there. But at the same time, Iran has become, in many ways, also a syncretic culture. In other words, the Iranian genius, if there is any genius, I don't know nowadays, but if there is an Iranian genius, has been really, in terms of not only accepting foreign influences, but nevertheless also shaping them. So what you get is it is an Iranized version of that, rather than Iran becoming Hellenized or Iran becoming Arabized or Islamized. So this is but I think that, so we had Alexander, obviously that was a great rupture in Iran, but Iran never became Hellenized. Probably it would have been better if they had become Hellenized, but they would have escaped a lot of things or whatever, but they didn't become Hellenized. But the most important rupture in Iran, and again you can make up your mind whether this was good for Iran or bad. I mean, I have my own ideas, and I think that comes across pretty well where my thing is. But the most important rupture for Iran, which is still relevant, Iranians have not really resolved this tension, was the Arab invasion. Now, Arab invasion per se would not have been such a bad thing. What is one defeat after another? I mean, that's fine. You can always recover from physical defeat. But the important rupture in Iran that happened, and the kind of left Iran with what I call a divided soul, was the spread of Islam. The problem is Iran really has never quite, many Iranians, I'm not saying everybody, but many Iranians have really never quite digested Islam. I mean, in many ways, they Islamicized Islam. I mean, even if you look, because today I think is Ashura, or yesterday was Ashura. I mean, even the ceremony of Ashura and so on that became, this was not done by the Arabs of the Kufa and so on and so forth. This was really essentially the resurrection of the old Persian mourning ceremonies for the Persian prince Siavash, Sug Siavash. This is, even now if you go to Bukhara, the Siavash, the young prince who was a slave. This is what it is. And many other things. There was very interesting article the other day, which was showing that these 5 fingers that people think is an Islamic symbol, actually this is the symbol of Mehr, the sun god, or Mitra, whichever you want to call it. And they use this. So a lot of the things you see that in Iran, of course, people have forgotten the origins of it. They don't. Very few Iranians who march in Ashura will think that what they are carrying is a homage to sun or to Mitra, to Mehr. But that is a lot of this thing happen. So there is this divided soul, and it has always been there. So when you look at even Iran's history immediately after the Islamic conquest, and it was a conquest, no matter what people say. From the beginning, you have a kind of a division in Iran between the Islamizers, and to some extent you might call Arabizers, and the ones that we can call Iran loyalists. And this has continued. It has continued over the history. Of course, the Iranian, Iran's ethnic composition also changed, and there were Arab migrants and so on, although most of them became Persianized, Persified. But there was one group that stayed, and I think that right now they dominate the entire thing, whether they actually, I have my doubts that, because now in Iran we have more descendants of the Prophet than probably ever existed, and even you account for, proliferation through the ages, but still there's not a single official in Iran that is not supposedly a descendant of the Prophet. Now, I'm not saying this is a bad thing. My own grandmother was a descendant of the Prophet and proud of it as all of that. But I'm just trying to say that this became a sort of issue. But this problem between Iran and Islam, it always said. Right now, for example, this is going on. I cannot, most Iranians will see the Arab invasion as probably the greatest calamity for Iran. And I think it was, I don't want to get into detail of it. But many people, some time ago, a couple of years ago, when I was doing research for the book, and so I saw that some people said that we have to celebrate the defeat of the Persian Empire at the entry of Arab armies to Nahavand. This is what I'm saying. When you see that there is this divide, it is. On the other hand, during Ahmadinejad, of course, this was used for political purposes. He wanted to bring in the cylinder of Cyrus and so on. And frankly, if you compare what Cyrus did after the conquest of Babylon and what, on the orders of Khalif Omar, they did to the library and other things in Iran, no matter, there has been a lot of historic distortion trying to say that this never did any damage to Iran, but that is really not so. So I think we have to keep this division between Iran and Islam, and it's there. This is there. Again, in this book, I give all kinds of documentation. Recently, for example, during the latest elections, there were Ayatollah Mesbah saying that you have to only vote for people who put Islam ahead of Iran. Now, in general, I think there shouldn't be any conflict between the two because they should be mutually reinforcing. But be that as it may, this is something that is there. And I will say why this has happened. There are other things, that Mongol invasions and so on and so forth, which also has left a big, I think, that division in Iran, and that is the Turco-Persian division, which is very important. All this Musavis thing and so on, and Karoubi as well. It's very interesting that both of them from minority things, linguistic minorities. Musavi was from Azerbaijan and Karoubi was from Lorestan. Although Lors are really Iranian peoples, it's a different thing. And so are Azerbaijanis, because, linguistically they have changed, but ethnically they are not much more mixed than other people in Iran. Iran has become mixed, obviously, like everybody else. However, I would submit that for a long time, and I think particularly after Iran's Shiaization, that there was some kind of a synthesis between Iran and Islam. In many ways, I do believe that in many ways Iran's embrace of Shiism was to give a kind of Islamic cover to basic Iranian nationalism. And I think that this helped Iran to survive for a while. I think, in fact, without that, the impact of Shiism, probably Iran would not have remained unified. I think that although the Safavids had a lot of shortcomings, but I think one has to be grateful for them that through the power of Shiism, they brought Iran together and basically mostly restored, most of Iran's ancient frontiers, because Iran under the Shah Abbas particularly was much more expansive and extensive than it is now. And I think that this Islam and Iranian nationalism, of course, not when I say of nationalism, let's face it, this is not the 18th, 19th century European nationalism. By nationalism, I mean a sense of that we are different, a sense of having had a history, a sense of having a number of symbols and traditions and so on that brought them together. If I had to say that what are the two greatest symbols of Iran's national identity, I would say that is the pre-Islamic Persian New Year Nowruz, and is the whole ceremonies and associated with Ashura, because these are very much for many of Iranians, even the seculars, at a very cultural, at a very almost subconscious level, this still operates on many Iranians. Now, but what happens is that, and these divisions become very much exacerbated, is that the process of modernization. Process of modernization, what it does, and I think this is what we see across the Middle East today, the process of modernization, which is essentially, no matter what people say, and notwithstanding all these new things about multiple modernities and so on, there is no such a thing as a multiple modernity. As somebody said, modernity is a package. You either buy into it or not. And modernity inherently is a secular phenomenon. Now, being secular does not mean that you are necessarily anti-religion per se, but what it means is that religion should be out of politics. So when you look at, for example, John Locke and so on, I mean, there is a difference between Locke's concept of modernity and, let's say, Voltaire's. Voltaire's was anti-religion in many ways, whereas Locke wanted religion to be neutral and the individual to decide on his or her religiosity. But the bottom line is, it has become fashionable, we academics have to write articles in order to justify our existence, and even books. And so we come up with this concept, but the fact is one has to call a spade a spade. Modernity is one package. Now, I'm not saying necessarily it's good. That I'm not here advocating modernity. It may be terrible. I mean, a lot of people wrote that, but if you want to be modern, then you have to get the whole package. You can't not have it. This, of course, what happened, however, this comes, obviously, you bring in a totally different view of politics. You bring in a totally view of individual. You bring in totally view of society and culture and values. Basically, you say what happened. And the thing to have to remember that values and power are interconnected. Those whose values dominate in society also dominate the power. That's why that in certain ideological societies, when, for example, like the Soviet Union, when the communists were in power, because communism had some, attraction and so on, and so they couldn't keep both communism and also modernize or do other things. And right now, of course, they are also backsliding. So what happens in Iran, that already by the mid-19th century, we see that there is a cultural duality that emerges. But this cultural duality still is very, very limited. It's limited only to a narrow elite. However, in the 1920s and the 1930s and then 40s and 50s and so on, as the modernization process accelerates, then the cultural duality increases, and also does the struggle with the connection between culture and power. So the change in the values and perception of countries' elite obviously leads to changes in the balance of power, for example, within society. So, to judge what is happening in Iran now, you have to go really way back, almost like to a constitutional revolution, and certainly during the Shah's time and so on. You see that what happens is that when you are secularizing a country, obviously, then those whose power base is religion and whose benefits comes from a religious culture is undermined. This happened in Tunisia as well. When we did that Islamic revivalism thing, I had a very, very good Tunisian scholar, and he has all these quotes from Ghanouchi. Ghanouchi was saying that I was a Zaytuna graduate. So when the Bourguiba was Europeanizing Tunis, because I didn't speak French, I couldn't find any jobs. The same thing happened in Turkey. When you secularize education, when you secularize the judiciary, obviously the ulama and all these other people lose their jobs. So all the opposition to this modernization is not just this is godless. It's because it's undermining their economic and social basis as well. The same thing in Iran, for example. Why is the merchant community was against the Shah? Well, Shah had a lot of flaws, that's for certain, but he wasn't the sort of the kind of a Genghis Khan or Idi Amin or whatever that people portrayed him. Part of the thing was that he was modernizing. Bazar in Iran, even today, they oppose, for example, industrialization policies of Hassan Rouhani because they only thrive on export-import. They don't want Iran to have any products because they want to bring the Chinese junk and to sell it, So it's not. So this is another thing that this created the incredible thing. The other thing is that so therefore from that we see that we have a cultural duality emerge. Complicating Iran's already civilization. So far we have already Iran versus Islam. Which is more important? I mean, all these fights over Nowruz. Clergy are saying we should not celebrate Nowruz, and people go ahead and celebrate. Or you should not do this, the night before Nowruz where you have fire and so on. This is very, very important. All this even... As I mentioned, the whole Ashura ceremonies or the lighting of light in general, it's the essence of Persian culture. They were not fire worshippers, whatever Saddam Hussein or Daesh says. Fire was the symbol of purity. Everything that goes into fire becomes, purified. So that's why they used to keep, the everlasting fire or whatever. So we already have that. Then we have this cultural division starts with modernization, and then it goes into politics. The divide between whether Iran should be a secular political system or an Islamic system dates back to the constitutional revolution. Even today, people in Iran are saying that when they attack people like Khatami, Rouhani, and so on who want to reform, they say, the seculars want again to repeat the situation of the Mashruta, where, the constitutional revolution. That was also there. Hukumat Mashrute, constitutional revolution, versus Hukumat Mashru'e, government of Sharia. So I think this is another divide that has its deep roots. So that 2009 election was not just something that happened suddenly. We suddenly had this group of Democrats. Frankly, I have my doubts whether those people are Democrat. I don't think any of them have any democratic, ball in their body. It's just the problem of Middle East. You can't have democracy without Democrats. So, but this is also very deep. But then the other thing that really brings into the focus, which has, in my opinion, at least in the past 70 years or so, has had greatest impact on Iran, has been the influence of the left. The Islamic Revolution is a misnomer. The left manipulated Islam to their own advantage, and I think that this was done on the assumption that somehow they will be able to do this, instrumentalize religion in order to bring in public support, because atheism of the Tudeh party and communist parties was the main reason why they had failed in Iran. To reach, Iran was not an industrial society, so their hope would have been for a kind of agricultural leftist revolution like in Russia or in China. But the Iranian peasantry was very religious, and still, although much less, but still is religious. So the left really infiltrated and dominated all aspects of Iran's. When you talked about politics or you talked about intellectualism in Iran, it was left. Whoever says that and so on. So one of the things inside Iran that you see so-called conservatives and the reformers is essentially a left-right split. Before the revolution, there became an alliance. We had a so-called Islamist Marxist, which is true. People laughed and ridiculed the Shah when he said that we have Islamic Marxists. But these are Islamic Marxists, And now, one of the fascinating things, because when I was doing the book, which has been marvelous, I have really had fun doing it, is because of this controversies within the regime. Everybody has been divulging their secrets now. So they had been attacking, saying that, you now say you are, follower of Imam Khomeini, but where were you in the 1970s? You were a communist, and you were sitting and saying all these things. So I think that everything in this is documented. Now, whether those people are reliable or not, I don't know, but these don't come from my imagination. They just are there. But the left has had a tremendous impact on Iran. And I think that basically Iran's politics have been dominated by left. And the bitterness of factional fighting in Iran is also because basically the conservative Islamists and the clerical establishment outsmarted the left. The left wrongly underestimated the rightist Islamist political savviness. However, without the left, Islamic revolution would not have succeeded. All the revolutionary councils that were created, or the revolutionary guards that were created, these come straight out of the Bolsheviks' playbook. They were the ones that did. Why do you think Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt didn't succeed? Because they didn't have that savvy. They didn't have the left. The left made the revolution in Iran, and then the right took over. Hence the incredible bitterness of this thing, and the incredible bitterness of the, Khatami era fightings, and then also against the 2009 that came, out there. And so the left essentially wanted a socialist government with an Islamic veneer, as Dr. Ali Akbar Virayati once said. The right, by contrast, Khomeini was very clear what he wanted. The left and the nationalist sort of pseudo-liberals just insisted on seeing in Khomeini something that was not there. And he played them like a fiddle. He told them he is democratic, he wants the republic, but he refused to answer what he meant by republic. He refused to answer what he meant by democracy. Oh, we will answer the question sometime in the question. Of course, he uses the royal we, not we as a group, he himself just as sort of. And so I think that this is also another thing. So in Iran, even today, the debate is, was Khomeini a Republican or was he really an Islamist? Again, this answer to this for me is crystal clear. Just read what he has said. He said Islamic government basically is the government of Sharia, not one word more or less. And then in that he said Islamic government is not a constitutional government. If constitutional government means in terms of a secular thing, it is constitutional because it has the Quran, which lays out the rules according to which it must be ruled. So people who refuse to understand this, so they are their own thing. And partly their problem was that they were so keen to gain power, individuals. And here I actually fault the nationalist liberal elite much more than the left. I mean, the left has its own vision. They wanted the revolution. They wanted the socialist revolution. But the nationalist elite, that is where really their power ambition blinded them. So that instead of, let's say, making a deal that, you could have a constitutional monarchy, even with the Shah leaving, and to avoid everything that happened afterwards, they decided no. And they have nowadays basically admitted that, in fact, Ibrahim Yazdi has in his memoir has said, we were so keen to see the Shah go that we didn't think what will happen afterwards. Well, this is what happens, and this is what you get. So as a colleague of mine, Farhad Khosrow-Khavar, put it, he said, now, how do you get out of an Islamic revolution? They want to get out of it, but they can't. This is because you cannot get out of an ideological government so easily. You can't turn an absolutist monarchy into a constitutional monarchy much easier without revolution. But you cannot, because ideology and power is so interconnected. So when we say about whether Khomeini was Republican or Khomeini was Islamist, this is not just an academic thing. Depending which version you accept, different groups in society benefit. They get the jobs, they get the contracts, they get this and they get that, and of course the clergy has their own thing. So this is another division, is just a division of the left and the right. Now, all this was at display, let's say that since Khatami came to power, but even before. And it's, out there, has been debated and gone and so on. With one exception, and that is that the Iranian leftism now has turned into a kind of a rather wishy-washy liberalism. And they don't know what they mean by it. And this is, unfortunately, the former left, which is now basically the reformers. The problem of the left the leftist influence has a legacy in Iran, and that is that I think there are very few people, aware people that in the Middle East are so still preoccupied with theory. I mean, they just want to, according to what theory we have to create our trade policy, for example. And I remember once I had written some book, and somebody calls me and said, can you explain according to what theory U.S. organizes its foreign policy? I was just saying, are you kidding me? I mean, but this is what I call theorizade, or theory toxicated or something. But this is the imprint of the left, and it is still operating. Now, so I have maybe 1 minute to make a conclusion and to see what is happening at the moment. I think that what I have, a picture that I have given has been mostly of division and division and division. And so that would leave, I don't want to leave you with this impression that therefore Iran is a country or a people on the verge of coming apart. Quite the opposite. I think that there has been a number of things happen that I think has made a positive, we can have a little bit more optimistic in that. The one thing is that, in my opinion, Iran has finally exorcised the Islamist demon, because they have seen it. This is not a theory anymore. Before, they had this notion of Islamic government that, you will have Imam Ali come and will just dispense justice and everything would be, this is a utopia. It never existed, and we don't have actually except some letters and so on. And then, plus, look what they did to Ali when he was dispensing justice. They killed him. They didn't like him doing to rule with too much justice. So I think that the Islamist demon is already exorcised. I think that the notion I'm not saying everybody, but I think that the notion that I would say at least 65% of the Iranian people now truly believe that the domain of religion and politics should be separated. Now, this doesn't mean that they are no longer religious. They are, although religiosity has declined. Just before coming here, I was reading an article, I think that it was the Friday Prayer of Isfahan was saying that our youth are running away from religion. So we have to be careful that not to make them enemies of religion. But so I think this is one thing that distinguishes Iran from the other Middle Eastern countries. The Islamic temptation still is in Middle East, even in Turkey. Just look at Erdogan. In Iran, this is gone. The other thing that I think that has come back, and that is the concept of Iran. Now, Iran has to be first. This is something which is that the regime is very upset about. Because, the interest of some group is good. Ayatollah Khamenei sees himself more like the leader of the Islamic world than the ruler of Iran. That creates tensions. That's why Iran is in such a, difficult situation now as is. Others, among the, more thoughtful people, are not there. The other thing is that Iran now is tired of extreme politics. I think that the 2013 election really was and in fact, I'm going to tell you that why that I think Iran has won over Islam. Because just in the run-up to the 2013 election, when Iran's conditions and sanctions and so on were very bad, very bad, the worst enemies from the, not extreme right, but from the left and right, they said we have to put factional dispute aside in order to save Iran. So I think this thing, a set of loyalty to this territorial Iran, to this cultural Iran with all its variations, I think for the majority of people is there. This concept of Iran has a strong Islamic, particularly Shia dimension. So it's not the concept of, we have to bring in Zoroaster back and so on and so forth. That is, sort of fringe things that doesn't happen. But the concept that we have to keep Iran is still very much. The other thing, I think, is that we have to avoid extremes of left and right. So the Rouhani's message of what he calls moderation and ta'amul, mudara, in other words, we have to get along with other peoples, is there. Now, does this mean that actually he's going to be able to implement this policy or not? I don't know, but I want to end it on a hopeful note. I am more hopeful that we might get a more I think that broad-based consensus emerging that is neither extreme nationalist nor Islamist, neither extreme left or kind of rightist politics, but that is more of a middle-of-the-road thing and a more realistic notion of Iranian identity, which definitely has a strong Islamic dimension to it, but without politicizing identity issues. So, thank you. Okay.